Hello there, Mrs. Mathers here. Today we're going to be talking about inflation. This is Learning Target 4A Part C in your packet, so you might want to pull that out and be ready to complete that as you watch the screencast today. We're going to be looking at four things. First of all, just being able to define inflation. What is it? How is it calculated? What are the three causes of inflation, and who particularly is most impacted by inflation? So let's just start with the definition of inflation. Inflation is just basically an increase in the average price level of goods and services produced in an economy. So if you take all the typical goods that we would buy in our economy and we compare them from year to year, we can see what the inflation is. It was kind of funny. My mom was reading through some letters from my dad when he was serving in the Korean War, and he said, well, I think we should stick to $60 a month for rent for a house, but if you find something at $65, that would be okay too. Now, that just seems ridiculous to us now when we think about how much houses cost, but that is because of the effect of inflation over the years since my dad served in the Korean War. So how is inflation calculated? This picture over here is something called a market basket. It's called the Consumer Price Index, and basically what the market basket is a way to look at typical expenses for a household. So 400 goods and services are calculated in this market basket. Each group of items, as you can see in the basket there, is weighted to reflect how much consumers spend on it. So you can see that housing is our largest expense, and for most people it is, and that would include not only your mortgage or your rent, but also the utilities, electricity, natural gas, etc. Transportation accounts for about 17% of our household expenses. That is going to include your car payment, your insurance, your gas, your bus fare, whatever it is that you use for transportation. Food and beverages, about 15%. Medical care, 7%. Recreation, 5%. 6% rather. Education and communications, 6%. Apparel, about 4%, and then other goods and services are the remaining 4%. So the market basket is an important tool for measuring something called the Consumer Price Index, or CPI. And if you listen to the news, that when they talk about the economics report or whatever, they'll talk about the Consumer Price Index often. They don't often use the term market basket, but just keep in mind the CPI is based off of the market basket and those things that we typically use to maintain our households. If there is a growth in the price of the index, then inflation has occurred. Okay, so keep that in mind. If the price of that market basket has overall increased, then we have had inflation. All right, so let's take a look at an example of inflation and how to calculate it. And this is just a completely arbitrary table. It is just numbers that are made up, but it's just a way of showing how inflation is calculated. So let's say in 2010, our market basket is 100. We don't have a comparison to the previous year, so we just leave that blank. In 2011, the market basket is $110. So you take year 2, which is 110, minus year 1, which is 100, and then you divide it by year 1. And so you have 110 divided by 100, and then you multiply that times 100, and you'll get the inflation rate of 10%. Now, in a typical year, that would be considered a pretty high inflation rate, honestly. But let's say that market basket increases all the way up to $160 in 2012. So now we take 160 minus 110 divided by 110 times 100, and we'll get a 45.5% inflation rate, which would be extraordinarily high. Okay, but that's how the inflation rate is calculated. And like with unemployment, we'll be doing some calculations in class and working on some of these things in class when we get back together. Okay, so what is normal? Actually, a certain amount of inflation is normal and expected. So the normal rate of inflation is 2 to 4% per year. And something called creeping inflation is about 3.4% per year. And that's pretty much what we've been having. Now, right now, during our current economic state, I've been hearing a lot of people talk about inflation. My son, for his job, actually is a data analyst, and he looks at what's happening with companies during the pandemic and how he sees the future, especially as it comes to inflation and the Fed, which is something we'll talk about later. There's some concern that we're going to have inflation following the pandemic. But I think we're going to have some monetary policy to try to keep that in check. Abnormal inflation is something like we saw in Germany after World War I. This is when inflation just goes into overdrive. In fact, what happened in Germany was that after World War I, the Treaty of Versailles put a lot of blame on Germany for World War I, and Germany had war reparations to pay. They were also doing some skirmishes in the Ruhr Valley, and they had to pay their soldiers. So their solution was, well, we'll just print more marks. Okay, that was their currency at the time. We'll just print more marks, and we'll be fine. Well, it doesn't exactly work that way. In Zimbabwe, in October 2008, they had a 231 million% hyperinflation. So both of these examples just show how inflation can get out of control, especially when the solution is just to print money. In deflation, the prices in that market basket go down over time. We might see this as good for consumers in the short run and for savers and for lenders. However, it's not so good for borrowers and businesses, because if they're not getting enough money to work on innovation and research and development, or even to hire more people, eventually that's going to cause the economy to have some difficulties. So the question is, why not just print more money? I've heard people say this, well, why don't we just print more money if we need it? Well, this is exactly why right here. So you print more money like they did in Germany in the 1920s. And this is someone buying a loaf of bread. So it had gone from 250 marks in 1923 of January to 200 million marks in November of 1923. The money was so worthless that the people just started burning it to keep their houses warm. So why would printing more money be a problem? Well, people want to buy more with it. The suppliers can't keep up with the demand, so they raise the prices, and they continue to raise the prices until the demand and supply equilibrium is met. And in the end, it just becomes worthless paper or whatever it's made out of. So what causes inflation? Quantity theory. In quantity theory, that's what I just talked about. You have too much money circulating. And that is going to just lead to overdemand and lack of supply. Then there's something called the demand pull theory. So if we look at this graph, we can see that what we call, this is called AD, or aggregate demand. That whole market basket, we want more. We want more of it. So that shifts the demand curve to the right. Okay, when we shift that demand curve to the right, because we have more aggregate demand, you can see that this pulls the prices upwards. So as our aggregate demand increases the quantity, and then the price level will also increase. So this demand for goods exceeds the supply, it causes a shortage, and it pulls the prices upwards. Okay, now I'm going to see if I can move my picture here to show you the other graph. The cost push theory has more to do with the supply side. So remember when we talked about tires and tigers? So the top graph reflects tires, a demand shift caused by increase in income or one of the other tires. Cost push theory is when the cost of production increases. So our supply is going to decrease actually. So the cost of production, things like the cost of resources, the cost of, let's see, the components of a computer, the cost of the wages of the people that are working for us. Any of those things that are the tigers are something that could push the supply curve to the left. And then when this happens, then also we have an increase in supply. An increase in price. Okay, so the supply overall decreases because of the cost of production, and then we have an actual increase in price. Okay, I'm going to bring this back down. On the next slide, we're going to just take a look at those two graphs again. And so just remember, this is the demand pull. So we have demand changing, and this is the cost push. We have the supply changing. Okay, so what we can get into with the cost push is a vicious cycle in which rising prices drive up wages, and then rising wages drive up prices, and this can result in an inflationary spiral that can be hard to break. So the example here, which is from your textbook, let's say that, some things in your market basket are getting more expensive. You're working for Acme Trucking Company, and you say, your union says, we need more wages. We need to have more money because we don't have enough money to buy all the things that we need in our market basket. So Acme gives you the raise. They give all of the truck drivers a raise. But then somebody has to absorb that raise. And so what happens here then is they raise their trucking rates to cover the wage increase. And then the consumer is ultimately going to get hit by that. And so the higher trucking rates increase the cost of getting goods to markets. And then the markets sell them at a higher price because it's costing them more. And then we get to the point where we have workers demanding higher wages still. So as you can see, this is a spiral or a loop that can just keep going and going and going. And in a sense, it has happened that way because we do have that creeping inflation. What we want to really avoid is having really large inflation, over 4%. So who are the biggest losers in an inflationary time? So first of all, people on a fixed income. A lot of times this is people who are retired, but it could be people who are have Social Security disability income or some other kind of income where it doesn't change. It doesn't reflect the changing CPI. So my mom was a school lunch lady, and when she got her pension, which I think is something like $250 a month, when she started getting that, she probably thought it was okay. And my dad, he worked for the Sioux Line Railroad Company, and his pension was quite a bit more. I think he got about $1,300 per month. So total, they were getting about $1,500 a month. But the problem is, since my dad retired in the mid-1980s, and my mom retired about 1990, well, it's a long time. And, when you live to be old, like they did, then your purchasing power is greatly diminished because your income has not kept pace with the rising consumer price index. And so I've noted over the years that their spending habits have had to change because they're not getting as much money relative to the consumer price index as they were when they first retired. But who are the winners in this scenario? So, people least affected by inflation, borrowers. Okay, I was able to buy my car in December of 2019, and I believe I got a 2.85 percentage rate. That is a pretty good percent rate for buying a car and for the interest on the car, because the inflation is likely to go above that. So the dollars that I'm paying on that car are less than someone that might buy a car this year or next year. Just like that, the same thing happened with our home. Our first home we bought was actually, the loan was 16% interest. That is enormous. There hasn't been anything that high since then. Now we pay 3.125% interest. And so these fixed payments that we have are going to take up less of a percent of our income as our incomes increase because of inflation. So remember that borrowers and homeowners, we are in a better position when inflation occurs. So, final note, what is inflation? It's the increase in the prices of goods and services over time, and I kind of like this fat dollar bill with Washington on the front. So you should be able to finish Learning Target 4A, subsection C, based on this. And then next week when we're back together in class, we'll be doing some calculations on GDP, on the on unemployment, and on inflation. Thank you very much. Have a great day.